The fact that such a leader came to power wasn't inevitable, and the fact that he failed was not inevitable. There were alternatives. Nor, in the end, and the book doesn't end with this, but because I treat the post-Soviet period, but it ends this argument. Nor was the end of the Soviet state in December 1991 inevitable. Though it's written as such in our textbooks now. Every now and then I dip in my daughter's textbook or the textbook of even my grandchildren, and that's the story that we now tell our children and our grandchildren. Now, I don't make these arguments by something I actually like, but I don't practice. What if history? Historians call it counterfactual. It's imaginary. So a historian will say, and there are all sorts of books like this, what would have happened if Hitler had died in 1929? Well, it's a serious question. I mean, would you have had World War II and the Jewish Holocaust? Or what would have happened if Stalin had been assassinated in 1933? Would there have been the Great Terror? Would there have been the Nazi-Soviet Pact of 1939? It's imaginary, but it's not without its value because it's a way of forcing us to ask, what is our explanation of events? Was it the personality of a Hitler or a Stalin, or was it a country's tradition? What was it? So it's not without merit, but that's not what I do in this book. I look at actual people and circumstances that existed in history. People who actually represented the alternatives that were not seized upon. People who sometimes died for those lost alternatives. And I link those lost alternatives to the fates of those people. And that's why I call the book, it's not the most successful title I could have thought of, but Lost Alternatives and Fates. In my mind, they're linked to what happened to the people that represented them. So in chapter 1, I look at Nikolai Bukharin, that Soviet founding father whom some of you know as the model for Arthur Koestler's famous novel, Darkness at Noon, about the Moscow Purge trials. And I look at him in his last year of life in his prison cell, in a Stalin cell, awaiting certain trial and execution, and writing, we now know, 4 books in a year, manuscripts. One of which my publisher, Columbia University Press, published, Bukharin's prison novel. The president of Columbia University Press is here tonight, Mr. Jordan, and that's a wonderful book if you want to read what a man can do under a death sentence. It's an autobiographical novel about his childhood. But he was thinking about the alternative that he had represented in Soviet history, which had put him in that prison. So I treat that and his fate. Under Khrushchev, millions of people were released from Stalin's gulag, and they came back to Soviet society. I call that chapter 2, The Victim's Return. But that created a ferocious political struggle in the Soviet leadership under Khrushchev about what to do about those people, whether they were virtuous people who had been victimized by the system and therefore historical and other forms of justice had to be done, or whether they were really criminals, as Stalin had said they were. And therefore they did not require any changes in the system. For that, Khrushchev, in part, was overthrown. So I link those two events. Then, in chapters 3 through 6, from different angles, I look at the Gorbachev period, which begins with his rise to power in 1985, his attempt to democratize and marketize the Soviet system, and then the end of the Soviet system in 1991. And along the way, I make 2 exceedingly unorthodox arguments. I won't tell you how I make the argument, but I think I write it in a way that even a general reader would understand it enough to say Cohen's right or Cohen's wrong. It's not complicated and it's not esoteric. It's a revisiting of what actually happened. I argue that one, though it's said all the time, Gorbachev actually did not fail. That the Soviet Union became by 1989 remarkably democratic. It was only the beginning. But what we call a democratic transition had begun. And that was also true of market relations and economies. And the related argument I make is that the Soviet Union did not, as books always say, collapsed. It went away, but not because it collapsed. Something else happened. It was collapsed. It was made to collapse for reasons that had little to do with its nature. And that brings me then to chapter 7. and my subject tonight. I call Chapter 7, Who Lost the Post-Soviet Peace? Begin with this question, and lots of people, if not most of the people in this room, are old enough to remember this history, though it has been largely forgotten. When President Ronald Reagan left office in January 1989, he wrote in his diary, "The Cold War is over." Almost exactly 20 years later, we, the United States, were in a now hot war, a new Cold War, a proxy war with post-Soviet Russia in that little state of Georgia on Russia's borders about a year ago in August 2008. That was a proxy American-Russian war. We created the Georgian Fighting Force and basically the government. About 100 American miners, military miners, traveled with the Georgian forces. The Georgians began it, the Russians finished it. It was very dangerous. What happened? What happened to we ended the Cold War? What happened in 20 years? For the last 10 years, the prevailing view in the United States has been that the Kremlin under Vladimir Putin, after he came to power in the year 2000, destroyed the opportunity to end the Cold War, destroyed the opportunity for a post-Soviet, post-Cold War relationship between the United States and Russia. Putin did it. Until then, according to this view, there had been a post-Cold War relationship between the two countries during the 1990s under President Bill Clinton and under Russian President Boris Yeltsin. So the Kremlin, then run by Putin, is to blame. A scholar would say that answer is misconceived. A more blunt-speaking person from Kentucky would say it's false. It's not a true answer. Or at least, to revert to being a scholar, it's largely untrue. Largely untrue. In reality, the opportunity to end the Cold War, which existed 20 years ago, was not squandered in Moscow in the 21st century under Putin. It was squandered in Washington in the 1990s under Clinton. That's when it was lost. We lost it. The evidence, which I set out in the book, is to be found in a history that we've rewritten and abridged or deleted, rescripted, of the relationship with Russia since 1988. Between 1988 and 1991, and now I look around this room and I see a lot of people who remember this, Soviet leader Gorbachev, President Reagan, whom many people here do not admire, but who did a very great thing at that moment. He did the right thing. And the first President Bush took gigantic strides toward dismantling and ending the 40-year Cold War. We could go into the details, but you remember it. And all three leaders said publicly and repeatedly, the Cold War is over, echoing Reagan. So we were all told, the two nations and the world, the Cold War is over. We're moving on. I witnessed some of those events from very close up. And I even played a tiny role in one or two of them. I thought at that time, 18, 20 years ago, that the three leaders exaggerated, as leaders do. The Cold War was over. They were being a little futuristic, I thought. But I did believe that they had created an opportunity to end it. It just needed to be seized. They had done the work, those three men. Their legacy simply needed to be acted upon, enacted. Remember, and this is crucial, they thought they had ended the Cold War a full year before the Soviet Union ended. That's very important. They were saying this in 1990. And, equally important, they believed and they said that they had ended the Cold War by way of negotiations. And that therefore, and I now quote President Bush and Condi Rice at the time, who later changed her mind, that the Cold War ended without any winners or any losers.